For a few hours, the Strait of Hormuz stopped looking dead. More than a dozen tankers moved through it, which meant crews were willing to test it. Cargo owners were willing to risk it. And the one waterway the whole market had been treating like a strangled artery suddenly showed signs of pulse. That was the huge thing that happened in Hormuz. Not a speech, not a promise, actual ship movement through the choke point that has been sitting at the center of this crisis. Then it turned ugly again. Iran tightened control, vessels trying to pass ran into renewed danger, and the same stretch of water that had just looked usable enough to calm the system was back under threat. That reversal is the whole reason this story matters. Hormuz did not reopen into safety. It flickered open, then snapped back into coercion, which told everyone watching that the route still works and still frightens at the same time. That is the split you need to hold in your head from the first minute. One fact said the corridor could still move. The next fact said it could still be bent by force. The real question after that was simple. If Hormuz could not be trusted, who had already built a way to survive around it? If you want the version that strips the noise out and gets straight to the leverage, subscribe now. And if you think Saudi Arabia just broke this choke point for good, put that in the comments now. Because by the end of this, that answer is either going to hold up or collapse. Saudi Arabia's answer was already in motion. The kingdom restored the East-West pipeline to roughly 7 million barrels a day after attacks had already knocked out around 600,000 barrels a day of production capacity and cut pipeline throughput by about 700,000 barrels a day. That is not some side note sitting off to the edge of the Hormuz story. That is the mechanism that changed the game overnight. While the sea route was proving it could only be trusted in bursts, Saudi Arabia rebuilt the main land route that lets its oil move west across the kingdom instead of waiting helplessly at the eastern gate. The brief passage through Hormuz came inside a 2-week ceasefire arrangement that included reopening the strait. That detail matters more than the headline version of the reopening. Traffic returned inside a narrow political pause, not inside restored trust. So every tanker that moved through that window was really doing two things at once: proving the route could still function and proving the route was still dependent on a fragile arrangement that could be tightened again the moment pressure shifted. That is why the move felt immediate. Nobody needed weeks of calm to understand what had changed. All it took was one short burst of transit and one restored Saudi land route to show that the old clean picture no longer held. Iran could still make Hormuz dangerous. It just became harder to make Saudi Arabia look completely trapped by it. Saudi Arabia framed the recovery around reliability and continuity of supplies. That was not ornamental language. It was a signal to customers, refiners, and governments that the kingdom still intended to behave like a functioning supplier even with Hormuz under threat. In a crisis like this, that kind of message is not public relations fluff. It is market warfare in polished clothes. Saudi Arabia was telling the world it still had a route, still had flow, and still had enough control over its export architecture to keep buyers from imagining total exposure. And the Saudi line stayed technical. Operational and technical efforts had restored full pumping capacity. Good. That is exactly the kind of language you want here, because it strips the story down to the hard mechanism. Oil can move west again. The system works again. The kingdom is not standing around waiting for Hormuz to behave before it can breathe. And that is where changed the game stops sounding like a cheap headline and starts sounding like an operational fact. Tehran lost the cleanest version of its leverage right there. Not all of it, not even close. But the clean version was gone. The version where Saudi Arabia looked stuck behind one threatened gate, watching every move in Hormuz like a hostage watches a lock, no longer held the same way once that land route came back alive. None of that makes Hormuz small. The Strait of Hormuz has been carrying more than 1/4 of global seaborne oil trade, around 1/5 of global oil and petroleum product consumption, and about 1/5 of global LNG trade. So no honest script can say Saudi Arabia solved Hormuz. That would be nonsense. The scale is too large, the system too dependent, and the choke point too central. What Saudi changed was not the size of Hormuz. It changed the degree to which Saudi survival depends on Hormuz behaving. Even the wider network of alternate pipelines does not replace the strait. They buy room, they cut exposure, they create options, but they do not come close to taking Hormuz off the map. That is exactly why the Saudi move matters the way it does. It did not erase the pressure, it changed its shape. Iran can still squeeze the region. It just becomes harder to use Hormuz as a total Saudi shutdown. Button, when major barrels have a live westbound escape route, again, that is the point where this stops being a shipping update and becomes a leverage story. A choke point does not need to be sealed shut to work as a weapon. It only needs to be dangerous enough, uncertain enough, and expensive enough that people start behaving as if the next passage might be their last clean shot through. Saudi Arabia did not take that weapon away. It made it less absolute. That is why Mohammed al-Jadassin's point cut deeper than all the public calm. The real question is whether insurers will insure and whether ship owners will actually send vessels back in. Kristalina Georgieva added the harder edge. Every day, tankers do not leave means at least 40 more days before first delivery. That is the fear chain in one sentence. A route can look open on paper and still stay half paralyzed in the real world because insurance, ownership, scheduling, and cargo timing do not obey slogans. That is how choke points keep hurting even when cameras catch movement. A tanker does not sail because a politician says the route is open. It sails when the risk can be priced, the crew can be convinced, and the owner thinks the ship will come back. Saudi's restored pipeline mattered so much because it let the kingdom sidestep part of that fear chain instead of begging it to loosen. The stress was already spilling far beyond crude. Reduced LNG flows through Hormuz, tightened global gas supply, and U.S. export terminals moved toward near-peak utilization as the market tried to compensate. That tells you the crisis was not just about whether a few tankers could squeeze through. The whole energy system was starting to rebalance around missing flow, delayed flow, and threatened flow. Saudi's route mattered because it relieved one major pressure point while the rest of the system was still straining. That same strain forced emergency action. The United States moved to begin an 86 million barrel strategic petroleum reserve exchange to stabilize markets after the disruption. Governments do not reach for that kind of measure because everything looks manageable. They do it because one unstable corridor can infect price, delivery, and political confidence far faster than official reassurance can contain it. When emergency barrels start moving, the market is telling you the threat is real, whether speeches sound calm or not. Then it moved from broad emergency posture into actual allocation. Contracts tied to 26 million barrels from West Hackberry were awarded under the exchange as part of the wider international push to keep supply moving. That is how the system behaves when it does not trust the route to stay stable. It buys time, it spreads barrels, it keeps the floor from dropping out while ships, insurers, and cargo owners decide how much danger they are really willing to absorb. Listen to what the three main players need from the story now. Iran needs the world to believe it can open, manage, or tighten Hormuz on its own terms and that preserves control. The United States needs the world to believe pressure is working without tipping into total market collapse. That preserves coercive credibility. Saudi Arabia needs something colder than both of those. It needs buyers to believe the kingdom can still deliver. And that is why Riyadh's most powerful move here was not dramatic language. It was getting the route back. And underneath all of this, around 20,000 civilian seafarers remain affected, and 21 attacks on commercial ships have been recorded in this theater since late February. That number should kill any lazy use of the word open. A corridor is not meaningfully open when civilian crews still have to calculate whether the next transit might turn into a live fire run. Strategy sounds neat from a podium. It looks very different from a merchant deck moving toward a narrow strait that has already taught the industry what it is capable of. And that human layer is exactly where Saudi's move gets heavier. Every barrel that can move west across land is one less barrel, forcing another commercial calculation inside the same zone of fear. The pipeline does not wipe out the danger. It changes who has to eat it. In a crisis built on choke points, that is real power. The wider maritime system has already drawn a line around the principle involved. Iran was told to refrain from closing or obstructing international navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. That matters because it raises the political cost of trying to normalize obstruction as just another bargaining tool. Once the route is treated as a matter of international navigation rather than a local pressure valve, the fight over Hormuz stops being a narrow regional story and becomes a test of how much coercion the broader system is willing to live with. And the operating picture stayed brutally plain. The threat level remained critical. Vessels were told to use extreme caution, and traffic through Hormuz was still severely constrained. That is the fact that strips the fake certainty out of both extremes. No, the corridor was not dead. Ships proved that. No, the crisis was not over. The threat level proved that. The truth sat in the middle. And that middle is exactly where Saudi Arabia changed the game. Not by making Hormuz safe, but by making Saudi Arabia less helpless inside an unsafe Hormuz. So here is the answer. Clean and without the fluff. Something huge did happen in Hormuz. The route showed it could still carry traffic even after everything that had happened around it. That mattered because once the corridor moved again, even briefly, everybody could see the difference between a dead artery and a dangerous one. A dead artery traps everyone. A dangerous one still lets strong players test, dodge, reroute, and adapt. Saudi Arabia changed the game because it was the Gulf power best positioned to do exactly that. By restoring the East-West pipeline when Hormuz was still flashing between movement and menace, Riyadh proved it no longer had to live inside the cleanest version of Tehran's leverage. Iran can still rattle the waterway, it can still unsettle crews, stress insurers, and keep the global system nervous. But it gets harder to hold Saudi Arabia in the same absolute way when Saudi barrels have another road out. That is not victory. It is not safety. It is not the end of the choke point. It is worse in a different way. It points to a longer, dirtier phase where partial flow and partial coercion can exist at the same time. Enough movement to stop a total break. Enough danger to keep everyone pricing fear into every decision. Enough pressure to leave the whole system leaning forward, waiting to see whether the next convoy gets through or turns back. And that is the new map. Hormuz still matters too much. Iran still has a weapon there. Saudi Arabia just made sure it is no longer a perfect one. Watch the route, not the rhetoric.